Hey all, hope all's well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 2 game from the 2019 Marshall Club Championship. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I drew a very interesting game against Grandmaster Irina Crush, and it was one in which I was winning at a few moments and just didn't put her away. And so I was hoping to play a little bit better in this one. Now, in a closed event, as is the case as this was, there are no easy games, and so my opponent in round 2 was another Grandmaster, this time by the name of Hedinn Steingrimsson. This is actually someone I'd never played before, but I was vaguely familiar with because the name Steingrimsson kind of stands out, and it's an Icelandic name, and he actually did turn out to be from Iceland. He's actually been living in the United States for some time now, I believe in Texas, if I'm not mistaken, and I think was doing some advanced degrees in Texas, and now maybe teaches or something along those lines, or does research. But so he's not playing chess all the time as he maybe did like 5 to 10 years ago, but he's still a very, very serious player, and I believe his specialty is within the computer science space. So, typically there's some overlap there with strong chess players and the use of computers, of course, especially with, as prolific as engines are these days. So, definitely someone that I knew would be well prepared and, a tough opponent to play, particularly with the black pieces. So, without further ado, let me jump in. So Hedinn opted for d4. I think he can play many different things, but d4 did seem to be his standard way of playing. And I opted for d5. And after c4, e6, I decided to take the game sort of in the direction of a queen's gambit declined type of structure. And Hedinn played knight c3. And then I went for knight f6, and after c takes d5, e takes d5, we actually have the exchange variation, which obviously has a long and storied history in chess, and is something that I used with quite decent success earlier this year. If you can recall, my game against Moisenko, for instance, is probably the biggest example. I have been kind of at home in the Carlsbad structure. So even in the game against Irina Crush, I was basically playing a Carlsbad structure reversed. So, yeah. So anyways, after e takes d5, bishop g5 was played. This is the normal move to basically pin the knight on f6 and in turn exert some pressure on the center. And here I played the move c6 just to reinforce this pawn, and so that now I can recapture on f6 with the queen if need be. And white played the move e3. And here I played bishop d6, and bishop d6 is a bit of a specialty of mine. Again, my game against Moisenko is probably the one that may come to mind for most of you that are watching, but I've employed this with success a few times. I also had a game against Tengi Ringor in 2018. Or actually, no, was it 2018? No, I think it was actually early. It was earlier in 2019. I think it was March 2019 where I actually employed this setup as well. And there's some different themes in the setup, so I do encourage you to check out the Moisenko game if you haven't already. And in fact, I was quite flattered to discover that the New in Chess yearbook, which is released at the end of the year, actually really highlighted my play in this variation as a pioneer in the line. So they actually devoted a whole chapter to the setup, which is quite unusual because typically in these systems the bishop goes to e7. So the idea with putting it on d6 is that it's actually more of an attacking piece, more so than a defending piece. And you basically say that this pin is not the end of the world. And so here after bishop d6, white played bishop d3, which is normal. And I castled. And after knight ge2, I played the move h6, and the move order doesn't matter so much. White could have started with the move queen c2, and I still would have gone h6 because bishop takes h7 always becomes a threat if the pin is still here. And so basically after knight g2, h6, it kind of transposes because after bishop h4, which was played now keeping the pin, I played the move rook e8. And rook e8 is what I would actually call a high-class waiting move. And the reason it's kind of a high-class waiting move is because you put the rook on the half-open e-file, and you actually invite white to castle kingside, which is in fact a mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is if you castle kingside, I actually have this bishop takes h2 check Greek gift idea. And this is actually one of the features of putting the bishop on d6 is that this tactic is possible, and it's all because the bishop on h4 is undefended. So after king takes h2, there's knight g4 check, and the queen can recapture the bishop. And if the king steps up to defend it, note that you don't go to h3 because then there's knight takes f2, which would be an embarrassing double check, which would also pick up the queen. So you go to if you really only have the option to go to g3 instead. And here the move g5 as actually just a position where black is just better because black recovers the piece on h4 still with a pretty decent initiative against the king on g3. So basically, because of this this basically bishop takes h2 idea, white has to play the move h3, and if they want to castle kingside. And h3 is not in itself a mistake or anything, but it's pretty dangerous to actually play this move and still castle kingside because you've actually created a hook in your position. And what I mean by a hook is you've created something that the black pieces can kind of latch onto as a potential for sacrifices. And that's essentially what happened in the game against Moisenko, is I was able to sacrifice quite spectacularly on the h3 square. So that's something to just be aware of. Now, Hedinn was, I think, aware of this game. It got a lot of notoriety. I was very thankful for it, but one of the things that you're a little bit wary of is when something does get really popular, you wonder if you're ever going to really get the chance to play the line again and have success with it, because everyone is really scrambling to figure out what's the best way to play against your idea. And so that's the kind of the gift and the curse, if you will, of playing a spectacular concept, is that you might be a little bit more conservative with doing the same thing again because you don't want to be caught out. And I had this apprehension, and for that reason I actually played the move knight bd7, which was a move that I had actually never played before in this position, but is an actual idea in this system. And essentially, knight bd7 was, I think, most popularly essayed by Kramnik, I believe, in a rapid game against Mamedyarov. But essentially, the idea is that you develop this knight, more modestly than what I did in the Moisenko game. In the Moisenko game, I played a5 and knight a6, and then rerouted the knight towards the king side via the e6 and g5 squares. And the idea here is that you're, basically covering the knight on f6, you free the queen up to move, and you basically just go for a different type of plan. Now, knight bd7 by itself is not like a bad move, but what I did in conjunction with knight bd7 was not exactly accurate, and we're going to get into why that's the case in a moment. So after knight bd7, white played the move queen c2, and basically we have the same position I had in the Moisenko game, except that I had the move a5 in that one, and here I have the move, I have the move knight bd7, and the difference is that with a5 and the move knight a6, which I actually came to play in the Moisenko game, I actually discouraged white from castling queenside. So just to give you a sense of that, I played a5 in the Moisenko game. Queen c2 was played, which is the standard, battery that white, basically plays in this system. And I played the very important knight a6. And the nice thing about knight a6 is that not only do you threaten knight b4, which is quite annoying, which would fork the white queen and bishop, but because of that threat, white actually winds up playing the move a3 to stop it, and this move a3 actually creates a hook on the queen side. So essentially now it would be pretty foolhardy for white to actually consider castling queenside here, because I'd have b5 and b4, and the a3 pawn serves as a hook for my pawn to kind of latch onto to rip open the b file. And so because of that, in the Moiseño game, I went knight c7, white castled kingside, I went knight e6. But you could see in this position, because of the tactic of bishop takes h2 that I was talking about, and because of the knight b4 concept, I actually managed to create a hook on both sides of the board with h3 and a3. So pretty much wherever white's king went, I'd have some type of counterplay and a potential for an attack. And that's really the key difference in the position in the Moiseño game and the one that wound up happening here, is because when I played knight bd7 here with queen c2, and now I played knight f8, there's really no hook on white's queen side right now. And as a consequence, white doesn't have to castle, kingside. And so that was actually what basically wound up happening, because after this move, knight f8, white castled queenside, and I don't quite have the same type of position that I can just force open a file to be opened. And so that's really the detail here that gives white kind of the dynamic chances that they're looking for without the same risk to the king. And quite frankly, I hadn't really examined this position in depth. I had just considered, well, I should probably not play the same thing I'd played in July and opt for a different course. And maybe that was a poor decision, but basically now I was completely on my own. So why, you might ask actually a move ago why I actually played knight f8. Well, the reason I played knight f8 is because I thought that if I played a move like b5, now white could go kingside, and one could argue that this c-pawn, this backward c-pawn, could be a potential weakness that white could come to actually exploit. So that's actually why I didn't rush with b5 before that, and I thought knight f8 was a sensible move. Typically, the knight can remaneuver itself to e6 this way, and it also covers the h7 square in some lines. I thought it was just a nice move to play and clear my bishop. But now after castles, it really becomes a race. And this feature that I was discussing before, the hook, is actually something that I have to now be concerned about with this pawn on h6. Because now that, the kings are castled on opposite sides, white will be looking to shove the pawns up the board to rip open a file. So that's really the thing that I have to, worry about here, and it's not a very easy thing to deal with. So, anyways, after castles, I went for b5 because I thought it was imperative for me to get my play going on the queen side. And now white played the move king b1. And this is actually a very, very intelligent prophylactic move. Basically getting the king out of the line of the c-file. In many respects, it's a move that you do when you castle queenside because you wind up protecting all of your pawns. Just like if the black king needs to be on g8 to protect all of the kingside pawns, the white king needs to be on b1 to protect their own queenside pawns. So that makes a lot of sense. And the other point is that if I play a move like b4, which seems desirable, the knight actually goes to a4 and does an excellent job of blockading my queenside pawns and controlling the one potential break in the position, which is c5. And so this is actually like a positional domination that I really wouldn't want and would just be better for white. And white could even entertain a plan with knight c1 and knight b3 and really just firmly blockade the c5 square so that I have absolutely no counterplay. So because of that, I didn't want to go for b4, and I thought, well, how do I keep my initiative going? And I decided to play a move that tried to keep that pawn storm going, but it was actually a blunder. And the move is actually a5. And the reason this is a blunder is because it kind of neglects white's ideas here. And whenever you're, trying to play anything on any idea, you should always just very quickly check any of the pawn breaks. Now, maybe I haven't defined pawn break on this channel before, and I know I've mentioned it a ton. And basically, a pawn break is defined as, in my opinion, by when any one of your pawns comes in contact with an enemy pawn. So in any position, you want to be considering the different sides' pawn breaks. So for white, a pawn break might happen on g5, a pawn break might happen on e4, and for black, a pawn break might happen on b3 or c5. And so being aware of the pawn breaks is really critical, because the pawn breaks are basically the highway through which the pieces get activated. And unfortunately for me, I just hadn't done that quick check of which pawn breaks were possible, because I was really just worried about my own play. And so really I thought, okay, g4, g5 is the one I really need to be wary of. But after the move a5, I actually invite a very, very pawn break right in front of my face with the move e4, and this is why this should not have been allowed. Instead of playing a5, which I did go for, I should have gone for a move like bishop e7. The point is that now the e4 break does not have nearly the same venom, because I've actually basically ensured that this pin is not a problem for me anymore. And the really huge nuance is that e4 here actually just loses, because I actually can just recapture on e4, and after knight takes e4, the bishop on h4 is uncovered, and if you take on e7, my piece is actually covered on e4. And so essentially, by retreating the bishop back to e7, e4 isn't even playable here, and white would have to go in another direction with g4, and we actually have a game, because now I just need to worry about this g5 break, and e4 is not really a move that I need to be concerned about. And I can even get on with my own play on the queen side with a move like a5, and, it's really anyone's game, because at the end of the day, even if white gets in g5, they're going to need a few more heavy artillery, essentially, to get any pressure on my king, because my knights are actually doing a pretty decent job of stabilizing my king side right now. So essentially that was the key, was to play bishop e7 and kind of nullify the threat of e4. And e4 was a threat that I hadn't really even considered seriously. So, I mean, in many positions, e4 is not a desirable move, especially without the pawn being on f3, because you basically give yourself an extra pawn island. So in many respects, I think in my mind, I basically was kind of maybe ignoring the break because positionally it doesn't make sense, and ignoring the tactical merits of the move. And after a5, the position is already really, really critical, because after e4, not only is there, threats against d5 and this annoying pin, but also e5 is actually just a stone-cold fork. And so essentially, this fork with e5 is a massive, massive threat, and really, really difficult to contend with, especially when you consider now that if d takes e4, white can just play knight takes e4, and still there's this pin here, there's a backward c-pawn here, and I just haven't gotten the counterplay on the queen side that I was looking for. And so, yeah, it's a really, really tough position now. I had recognized that. I was very frustrated with that I even allowed this, because it really should not have been allowed. And one of the problems now, too, is that if I go bishop e7 here and kind of just, try to defend passively, now white's, basically can initiate a steamroller in the center with e5, let's say takes, and f4. And quite frankly, this position is not one in which my prospects are very good, because white has a real potential to kind of break things open in a very, 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 very powerful way. So, yeah, just a huge, huge oversight on my part. And basically here I was basically trying to scramble to figure out what was the right way to go. So I started with the move b4, which is actually sensible, challenging this knight on c3. And this is basically what I have to do, because I need to try and ensure that the knight is not the one that recaptures on e4, but the bishop, because at least in that, if the bishop is the one that recaptures, there's more pressure to this pin. So b4 does do that. But here Hedinn played, very, very strong and accurate move, bishop takes f6. And this is the other, key component of the e4 move, is because my knight has actually left the d7 square, it really seems like I'm obliged to recapture on f6 with the queen, not to spoil my structure. But if I recapture with the queen, then e5 is, again, a very uncomfortable and devastating fork. And so, yeah, really just a tough spot. Now, I probably again should have, taken a step back here and, thought very concretely and started to calculate lines and think about which positions were going to be the best ones that I'd have a good chance of surviving in. But unfortunately, I just hadn't gotten to the point where I was in, total desperation mode, and I should have been, because I played fairly quickly the mechanical queen takes f6. And I knew full well that, e5 was the next move, but I thought, well, is this really the end of the world? And it actually turns out it kind of is. And instead, the move g takes f6 would have been considerably stronger. The point is now, e5 is not an actual move that concerns me because the square is covered. And so the white knight has to move, and knight a4 is obliged. And even though I have a really ugly pawn structure on the king side, I also have a backward pawn on c6, and even my pawns on the queen side on b4 and a5 are kind of stymied and can't actually get at the king. At least I have the two bishops here, and the bishop pair can give me, pretty decent counterplay in an open position. And so after d takes e4 now, trying to break up white's pawns, I can play bishop takes e4 and bishop a6. And even though white is still quite a bit better, this is not a losing position by any stretch of the imagination. And I have active minor pieces that will, give me an opportunity to kind of fight here in a way that was actually different from the line in the game. Because in the game, I kind of just played too mechanically and robotically and didn't really challenge white. And so this would have been a much, much better try. And in fact, after bishop a6, bishop f3 and bishop b5, also note that I'm not even down material. Bishop takes c6 is not really possible because the e2 knight is always hanging. And, positionally, again, yes, I have some weak pawns, but my king is actually relatively safe because g4, g5 is not even really a thing anymore because I have two pawns actually covering that square. And I can't do the potential to try and, get some counterplay here with the bishop pair. So really not a clear position at all. And, white would be better, but not that much better. Instead, though, I played this move queen takes f6, and this is truly dreadful because after the move e5, I have to just move my queen again. If I could, try and sack a piece, but after bishop e5, d takes, and rook takes, the knight goes to a4. White's just a piece up. My pawns aren't even rolling because c5 is effectively blockaded, and I just don't have enough here. So it's just not worth it. And so I have to move my queen again, and it's like, well, if I move my queen back, well, this knight on a4 can just move away. My bishop has to move. And then not only is c6 hanging, potentially, but there's also f4, which again is this massive steamroller in the position. So the two bishops just aren't really a factor here if the position is relatively closed and I can't sort of make stuff happen. And so basically, after e5, the position's already nearly lost. Now, it turns out here that, essentially queen d8 is the best move, but I mean, playing this type of position just seems completely lousy to me. I just don't see any salvation here. f5 and maybe even f6 is just going to come way too quickly. So instead, I kind of just played what I thought was the best practical try, which was queen takes f2. But of course, this kind of accelerates white's play. And so here, white played the very simple-looking rook d f1, pretty much inviting me to take more material. And the point is that if I take extra pawns, I'm just opening up files to the rooks, and white is nearly completely developed, so giving up a few pawns to open up the rooks to attack my king seems like a really, really good idea, especially when you consider that several of my pieces are on the queen side just aren't really playing yet. And so after rook df1, I actually went queen h4, kind of acknowledging that, taking on g2 is probably too much. But, just to illustrate, after queen takes g2, rook h g1, this position is already, going to be gone anyway. I mean, for instance, if I take another pawn with queen takes h3, now knight f4 is decisive. And if I move my queen again, just queen g2, threatens mate on g7, and still I have to worry about this bishop on d6. And so there's really no hope here. And trying to play g6 to block will result in some really, really nasty sacrifices. So there's just a myriad of ways that white can kind of bring home the bacon here. So instead, I played the move queen h4, trying to basically almost like a hit and run approach, take that pawn and then run away. But here, I think Hedinn played a very, very accurate move, knight a4, basically not making the position a mess that would give me counterplay. I mean, you could consider playing e takes d6 and trying to take away my bishop pair, but here after b takes c3 and knight takes c3, all of a sudden, if I round up this d6 pawn, my position starts to look very, very playable. And so black would actually be quite okay here. And note also d4 is already just hanging. So giving up your beautiful pawn wedge here to get the bishop doesn't really make sense. And instead you play the move knight a4 to just restrict all of my counterplay on the queen side and also force my bishop to move. Not to mention the fact that c6 is still going to be hanging. And so I now went b3 just to sort of back up. Part of the reason I did that is because if I go, bishop e7, I thought one of the major problems I have is that queen takes c6 might be possible anyway, because if bishop d7, trying to kind of get this piece on a4, there might even be queen takes d5 and queen takes f7 as an idea, and that actually really concerned me. But there's even also, after knight a4 and bishop e7, white can even start with knight b6, attacking the rook, and then taking on c6 with the queen, because then bishop d7 is not possible because the knight would be covering the square. And so pretty much there's just nothing going in this position. And so I played the move b3 at least with the hope, really more hope than anything, that maybe by throwing in this intermediate move, I might get counterplay on the b file and also give the b4 square to my bishop. But here, he very, very correctly judged that taking the pawn was actually kind of a waste of time, and instead played the move queen takes c6 anyway, judging that if I play b takes a2, the king could just step to the side and be completely secure. And in this particular position, the bishop on d6 and the rook on a8 is actually hanging. So very, very nice judgment here and calculation by Hedinn. So I played b takes a2, what the heck, just to try to, at least get that pawn. And, of course, white played king a1, not taking the pawn and basically using it as a shield. This is a common theme sometimes when there's a really far advanced pawn that is, causing you problems. Eventually, you just allow it to stay there because your king is relatively secure and it doesn't open up a file in any way. So after king a1, I still have this problem of the bishop at d6 and the rook on a8. So now I played bishop d7, actually attacking the queen and keeping an eye on that knight on a4. But here, Hedinn just played queen takes d5. And again, very, very accurate play by Hedinn, basically pointing out that I'm just lost here, and taking on a4 doesn't really do me any good because of the sensitivity of f7. Again, if I do take on a4, rook takes f7 is a massive idea. Also, queen takes f7 should also be nice, with the idea that after king h8, queen f5 is almost mate. And, of course, white can also just take on d6 and recover the piece. So there are plenty of ways white can kind of proceed here with a very, very strong initiative. I'm not sure what's the strongest, but rook f7 also looks, like I said, very attractive, creating all types of discoveries. And the point is basically I'm lost, however you slice it. And so instead, I played the move bishop takes e5, at least trying to take one of these central pawns. And the idea here was that if white actually recaptures, this would actually be probably a poor decision, because I can now play bishop e6, shore up my king side a little bit, and I'm still eyeing the a4 knight. So I thought that was just a way to just get rid of one of these central pawns that was kind of a wedge for me. But now Hedinn played the move rook takes f7, and this basically just secures Hedinn 2 pieces for a rook, because essentially the discovery checks are really, really powerful, and also the bishop on e5 is still hanging. And so in this position after rook f7, I played bishop e6, trying to nullify these discovery checks, and Hedinn played rook takes f8 check. And you can see here he does get 2 pieces for the rook, because after king takes f8 and queen takes e5, it's just white has 2 knights for a rook. And so you might say, well, I mean, is it really so bad? I mean, he has 2 knights for the rook. But aren't the pawns equal? Isn't this not as bad as it looks? Well, frankly, my king is so weak and exposed that I couldn't even begin to defend here reasonably. This rook can come to f1 and give check. There's this knight idea of coming to f4 and maybe coming to g6 and creating a fork. There's also times where a queen e4, queen h7 battery might be playable. And even queen trades should give white a winning position, because, again, the pieces are just simply too much for the rooks here. So really the rest of the game, honestly, doesn't really deserve much comment. I could have resigned here, but I thought at least in Hedinn's kind of mild time trouble that I'd at least make him make a few moves. There really just isn't much going here, and you could just see that I was pretty much outworked from after this e4 move. But let's just see the rest of the game. So after queen takes e5, I went bishop f7 to try and shield my king and attack this queen on e5. Queen c5 check was played, king g8, and now knight b6. Very, very annoying move. You can see my rook doesn't even have a whole ton of squares here on the back rank. I went rook a d8, at least centralizing my rooks, and then rook f1, another excellent move. And there's some circumstances where Hedinn can even entertain playing rook takes f5, rook takes f7, just drawing my king out and then playing some check like queen f5 or bishop c4. It's just not a position that's holdable. I played the move rook e7. It's protected by the queen h4, and maybe on a really good day, I would love to double rooks and try and threaten mate on e1, because my bishop is covering the a2 pawn, at least for now. But here, Hedinn just played the move knight c4, and basically my long shot dream of doubling rooks and playing for something on the e-file is just quickly stymied by the knight blocking that file. I went bishop g6, a little bit of misdirection, essentially trying to draw the bishop off the e2 knight, but bishop takes g6 was played very quickly, and after rook takes e2, knight e5 was played, and I went rook e1 check, basically just a check. There's nothing more than that. Rook takes e1, queen takes e1, and king takes e2 is played. And you can see here that my king really only has 1 square. White can begin these checkmating windmills with queen c4 check. And so in this position, I actually resigned. Just to give you a little sense of what that could look like, let's say I play a move like queen e7, or queen d2. Well, there's queen c4 check, king h8, knight f7 check, king g8, and of course you can actually finish it with style with knight takes h6, king h8, queen g8, rook takes, and knight f7. And these windmill mates are never a pretty sight if you're on the receiving end of them, but they are at least aesthetically pleasing, so that's why I decided to show it. But before that could even happen, I just decided to resign because there's just no stopping it without giving up the queen. And if I play a move like queen b4, white is perfectly happy. You're just taking on b4 and then playing a move like d5, and the position is just completely lost. I can't take on d5 because bishop f7 check, and white can slowly push this pawn up the board using the 2 pieces, and my rook won't have much say in this fight because it's not a fair fight. So before it can really get to this, I offered his hand and decided to try and fight another day. Tough game for me, I think, just because I didn't really get anything off the ground, and of course, I've done quite well in the Carlsbad system, but when people are looking at your games and looking at your lines, and especially in sharp lines, when you have success in sharp lines, you have to have a bunch of new wrinkles. And unfortunately, I just hadn't had at this time a lot of new wrinkles in the system, and so it's probably unwise to go for it. Or maybe I should have just played what I'd played before and forced him to show an improvement, but I didn't do that either, and that's a problem. So I basically went to something I didn't know well at all, and of course I got punished for it. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.